It's so good to see you. My name is Greg Wilhelm. I'm the director of Mason Creative Writing, which includes both the BFA in Creative Writing and MFA in Creative Writing programs. So it's so cool to see people who represent both of those communities together in this same room. Given our line of work and my line of work, I'm always on the lookout for new craft books. And if you go into my office, you'll see that my shelves are replete with various craft books that I've collected over the years. And I have to say, rarely does a new one come out that I really get behind and get excited about. But that happened with Steve's new book, Truth is the Arrow, Mercy is the Bow, a DIY manual for the construction of stories. And so I'm teaching it for the first time this semester. And I think the students who are in that class or in the audience tonight can attest that it's been a really good inspiration. They lead the conversations that start each of our class meetings. And so two students will lead that conversation based on a certain portion of this new book by Steve Almond. And it's just been a real treasure and something that I look forward to teaching again and again. Steve Almond is the author of a dozen books of fiction and nonfiction, including the New York Times bestsellers Against Football and Candy Freak. His debut novel, All the Secrets of the World, was published by Zando in 2022, and Zando is the publisher of Truth is the Arrow, Mercy is the Bow. His essays and reviews have appeared widely in venues ranging from the New York Times Magazine to Poets and Writers to the George Strait newsletter. His fiction has appeared in the Best American Short Stories, the Pushcart Prize, the Best American Mystery Stories, and among other publications. He teaches creative writing at the Nieman Foundation and Wesleyan University. Nieman Foundation is associated with Harvard and Wesleyan University, and he lives outside of Boston with his family. And since this is a craft book, I do want to read one thing we didn't get to talk about in class. Steve was gracious enough to spend an hour from 4:30 to 5:30 with my BFA in Creative Writing capstone students. And there's a personal statement that goes with these bios on the NEA website. And we're going to be writing and learning how to write artist statements later in the semester. But I thought this portion, this excerpt from Steve's personal statement, might set the context for talking about a book about craft. For 30 years, I've been trying to make money as a full-time writer-teacher while also working on projects that, by design, have almost no chance of making money. It's a constant hustle, and the tension between commerce and art was wearing me down. The grant will give me some time to work on a new collection of stories and a second novel. It took me 30 years and many failed attempts. We talked about failed attempts and that word failure in class just a half an hour ago to write the first novel. I'm looking forward to shaving that process to say a decade. And as we talked about that in class. Now, kind of the idea is, can you get your art to a certain place quicker, faster, by the end of the 14 weeks than where you were in August when we started working together. Let's see. A lot of his luck has to do with luck, sensibility, and sort of what the judges of the NEA Prose Fellowship saw in his work, and also maybe what they ate for lunch. So he was grateful to the judges and whatever they had for lunch that day. So please join me in welcoming author, NEA Fellowship in Prose recipient, and the craft book author of Truth is the Arrow, Mercy is the Bow, Steve Almond.
I'm just going to read real quick thank you, Greg. That was a beautiful introduction. I, of course, completely forgot whatever I wrote. And I was like, oh, okay, that's what I had to say. I've reached an age where most of my conversations are around things that I don't remember anymore. But I do remember kind of the genesis of writing this introduction because I was trying to figure out, I'd written this, it is a craft book, but only one section of it is about craft. The next section of it is about where stories come from, inspiration, I guess. And then the next section, which is really the one that's most interesting to me, is the what I call the evil voices, what keeps people from pursuing the truth unambivalently. The ego doubt, the ego need, the competitive anxiety, whatever it is, anxiety about hurting people or disappointing them. So it is a craft book, but it's kind of unorthodox. It's really more about storytelling, the storytelling impulse. And So I tried to write all these various introductions and failed over and over again. And I finally gave up, which has been a very useful strategy for me because it takes some of the pressure off. And I think almost every bad decision that you make artistically it results from feeling too much pressure and getting self-conscious and then getting distracted from what we actually want to say. And so I gave up, which was really smart. And then I thought, just before the book I needed to finish, I wore my fancy shirt for you. I have one. It's sort of shiny. This moment came to me that was so weird, but also seemed to me the most dramatic example of why storytelling is so exciting to me. So I'll read it. It's just a short introduction. It's called By Way of Hello, and it's got a subtitle, Red Bicycle, White Moon. In May of 2019, by some colossal blunder of optimism and mistaken identity, I was invited to deliver the keynote address at the Bao International Forum on Writing Education. What did this mean? Who was Bao? I had no idea. 6 weeks later, I stood in an immense outdoor mall on the outskirts of Beijing. It was nearing dusk. The concrete paths glowed orange. I was handed a microphone and told to address a cadre of dignitaries, which apparently I did, then shown an array of pastel booths celebrating the wonders of writing. Shoppers gawked in poignant confusion, then swooped into the brightly lit showrooms of American Eagle and Victoria's Secret. The keynote was held in a movie theater. Promotional posters hung all around, identifying me fervently and erroneously as a famous Harvard professor. I teach at the Nieman, which is affiliated with Harvard, but I am not a Harvard professor, certainly not a famous Harvard professor. Before I could take the stage, a government official seized my passport, at which he squinted for some disappointing minutes while my chaperone circled in panic. Eventually, I was permitted to deliver my address. It was greeted with widespread bafflement. My translator, Shiro, he was confusingly Japanese, later explained. The speech centered on a tale of sibling rivalry. Owing to China's one-child policy, almost no one in attendance had any siblings. Having botched my central commission, I looked forward to retiring to my hotel room for a nourishing bout of self-hatred. I was delivered instead to a dismal flat on the 21st floor of a condo tower. My cell phone didn't work and there was no internet, so presumably I would be able to sleep, but my circadian functions were frayed from a 16-hour flight over the polar ice cap. At some point, I did lose consciousness, which I only know because I was jolted awake minutes later by a home alarm on the scale of Wagner, accompanied by a robotic voice imprecating me in Mandarin. I staggered about in the dark, introducing my face to various inconveniently placed walls before locating the control panel, a flashing red square decorated with frightening symbols. I pawed at these for a time, envisioning the scene that would ensue once the police arrived. My hosts had taken possession of my passport naturally, which meant my only source of identification was a mangled copy of the previously cited promotional poster. Famous Harvard professor detained, the headlines would read. American University denies affiliation with incoherent fugitive. Yeah, this is sort of intended to be funny. It might not be coming off, but it was very weird. The forum was going perhaps worse than expected. Organizers described my final duty as a live demonstration. I assumed this meant teaching a few ringers at a local university. Instead, I was led to the cavernous banquet room of a bustling restaurant, which smelled deliciously, weirdly, of garlic. It was crammed with teachers, many of whom had flown thousands of miles to see me, all of whom were poised to set pen to notebook. Shiro explained that China had little formal tradition when it came to creative writing training. I would now show 300 instructors, and by extension, in my own grandiose vision, the entire country of China, how to teach creative writing. Presently, my pupils appeared, a procession of uniformed 7th graders from a local private school. They filed into seats at the front of the room, looking as miserable as you might expect, which is to say, slightly less miserable than me. One of the unexpected benefits of operating on an hour of sleep in a country far from home is that, at a certain point, you surrender the notion that you will be of use to anyone. I had reached that point. And so I launched into a sermon about the literary dividends of obsession, ardently seeking eye contact with my charges, who were understandably staring at Shiro, the dashing translator. I then asked them to write about an obsession from early childhood. In America, the protocol was pretty straightforward. Here, it would involve 5 additional steps. Step 1, Shiro translates my instructions into Mandarin. Step 2, the students then write, then read their pieces in Mandarin. Step 3, Shiro translates them into English for me. Step 4, I offer my feedback in English. And step 5, Shiro translates my feedback back into Mandarin. How would all this go? My money was on disaster. The students looked solemn, dutiful, petrified. They were, it seemed to me, trapped in a kind of anxiety fugue, which, years from now, they would attempt to describe to some patient lover. Yes, that was the day I was plucked from my normal class and put on a bus. I believe it was a punishment of some kind. They drove me to a vast cafeteria filled with hundreds of teachers. Some creepy American man began raving. They said he was the teacher, but he dressed like a vagrant. He ordered me to write a personal story, which I had to recite while the strange teacher stared at me. I probably don't need to tell you that not one student volunteered to read, nor that a sense of doom descended upon that room. But then the plot took an unexpected turn. A slender girl rose from her seat and, trembling only slightly, read a stunning piece of prose. It was about the bicycle she had coveted as a child, a gleaming red machine with silver handlebars and tassels. She spied it in the main square of her town, resting against a fountain. Her father felt a bike would be a distraction from her studies, and her mother didn't argue with her father. In dreams, the bike shone under the white moon. She imagined riding it constantly. She could feel her legs pumping. When she closed her eyes, it was still there under the moon, slightly too large for her, incandescent. Once, when no one was around, she rode the red bicycle. Or maybe she made that part up. It felt like flying. She rode it all the way to the next town, then to the moon. She never came back. Shiro whispered his translation. It was urgent and dizzying. The girl's voice rang out like a hymn. When she had finished, there was a sustained silence, as if we were in church. Suddenly, a figure in back, one of the few male teachers in the room, jumped to his feet and began yelling. Shiro provided a play-by-play of his rant. He didn't understand what sort of class this was or how such an assignment would be graded. What criteria could be applied to such a text? It was all just romantic nonsense. His face flushed. But he was immediately enveloped by a sea of women who were no less furious. They began to yell at him to quiet down. For a few glorious moments, it appeared they might wrestle him to the ground. Apparently, they had endured men like this before. I don't remember what sort of notes I offered the girl. It hardly matters. We'd all felt the same holy jolt. I've gone looking for that feeling everywhere. From time to time, I've found it in my own writing. More often, it happens in the classroom, even in China, amid the blaring alarms and briars of translation. I happen to believe that every single person on earth is a storyteller. We are all trying to understand the story of our lives. Some of us are trying to make a career or a calling from the practice of writing. The essential tools of that pursuit are patience and forgiveness and courage. You have to want to tell the truth. The essays collected here are a compendium of insights and anecdotes drawn from my struggles as a writer and my work as a teacher. There's a section on craft, a section on the origins of story, a section that reckons with the psychic and emotional barriers we face in our ambivalent pursuit of truth. It can be tempting to retreat into the technical or the mystical when it comes to writing. For the most part, you sit alone and make decisions. You reach inward toward the joys and sorrows you are meant to share with the world, toward the red bicycle beneath a white moon. I hope this book will be a worthy accomplice. So that's sort of, I guess, the book's kind of handshake, or I don't know. It's kind of like the moment where I was like, yeah, that's what this book is about, sort of. So, Greg, do you want to ask?
Yeah, I'll stay here. I don't think anybody. I promised you a softball and a hardball, so here's my softball. You mentioned obsession and fugue state. What were you obsessed about that compelled you to want to compile a craft book and offer that to the world?
Well, I think I found myself saying the same things over and over again to students and developing a kind of a language, like a shorthand. So for instance, I would say over and over again when a student leapt into scene in a way that didn't allow the reader to understand what the character knew, what they were afraid of, what they were hopeful for, where they were, who they were talking to, and most of all, what was at stake. I found myself saying over and over and over again, when you create a situation of informational inequity, which I know sounds very technical, but it just means when the reader doesn't know the basic stuff the character knows, they can't feel what the character's feeling. And I said that over and over again. Don't give me show, don't tell constantly. Tell me just enough that I can feel what I'm being shown. I said that over and over again. If you want the reader's attention to be high, if you want them to be in your story, you have to keep the rate of revelation really high. The reader has to be learning new and essential things all the time. Anytime you start repeating yourself or you tell them things that aren't essential, their attention's going to start to drift because their rate of revelation has dropped. So I would say these things over and over again and talk about chronology or plot or whatever it was over and over again. And I guess I just wanted to try to collect it all in one place. And I also felt like most craft books are written from the perspective of somebody who kind of knows it all and is delivering the news from on high. And my feeling as a writer is that I'm almost always choked with doubt. Most of what I write fails. That is, it isn't really as perfectly arranged on the page as it is in my head. And so I'm disappointed and down on myself. Most of the things I write don't end up getting published. That's the sort of hidden secret that every writer knows. I mean, I read like Birds of America, the Laurie Moore collection, like 90 times in grad school. And it seemed to me there was just using capable of writing a bad sentence. Every sentence was fucking electric. And then, you go and look at Laurie Moore's papers and you see all the shitty first drafts and second drafts and the ones that didn't turn out. And then you have a much more forgiving or realistic attitude, which is failure is not a bug. It is a feature of any kind of artistic creation. And I guess then that got me into the category of wanting to write a book that included where I think stories come from, which is from our obsessions and our doubts and our sort of libidinal drives. And they're to me dependable sources of inspiration that I wanted to write about. And I also wanted to write about the evil voices that keep you from doing your best work. And I think people talk about craft and they think that's going to be enough, and it's not. Because even if you have all the craft up here, you still have to sit and deal with your anxiety and your doubt and your ego need and all that stuff. So I felt like I kind of had enough to say that I wanted to gather it all together and kind of like put it in a book. And that's, I think, about 30 years of teaching of various sorts.
So this next question is a craft question. You mentioned just now the chestnut show don't tell, which is a chestnut that I think many of us would just as soon roast and get rid of. It has some merit. And I thought you were going to touch upon that in class. You got close to, I think, touching upon that in class earlier. I think one of my takeaways from this book was just sort of helping me remember and return to the power of exposition, and particularly insofar as the way you were discussing it in class about having a narrative stance, or having your narrator have a stance.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about exposition and sort of?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that makes the way I would say it is that everybody who's trying to write stories, literary storytelling, is living in an age where the dominant form of storytelling by a factor of like 99-1 is visual storytelling. It's films and TV and whatever you're watching on YouTube and now TikTok. And those are also valid and beautiful and illuminating storytelling forms. I'm not here to shit on them. But when you are just working with words, which are little specks of ink that the reader has to translate, and then they have to make the TikTok video in their head or the movie, you only have one collaborator, and that's the reader and their imagination. And you have to somehow perform this miracle. In a TV show or a movie, you've got like 1,000 people who are collaborating to create the story. And in a short story, or even a poem or a novel or a memoir or an essay, there's just two people working together. There's the writer and the reader. So you have to be in my view, you have to be so incredibly generous to the reader. You don't have to like pre-chew their food, but you need to let them know where the hell they are and what's at stake and who they should care about. And there are lots of ways to do that. Show don't tell makes sense when it really means when a character's in a dangerous moment, they don't want the emotional danger of the moment articulated by the author. They want it experienced by the character. I fucking sign off, absolutely. But there is also the matter of trying to get the basic information across to the reader so they know the world we're living in and who they should care about and what that person should care about. And a lot of that can be done way more efficiently by having a really powerful narrator. And you know this from reading all of the novels of the 19th century and the 18th century, because there was no TV and movies. And the narrators were in a Dickens novel or a George Eliot novel or an Austen novel or a Tolstoy novel or a Dostoevsky novel were absolutely both omniscient in certain moments and also deeply rooted in the character's experience in other moments of high drama. And that is, to me, the most pleasing kind of book to read, where I feel like I have this guide. I don't feel like somebody's stuffing me in. When I read my work, early drafts, and my students' work, I sometimes feel like I'm being grabbed by the throat. They just plunge me into scenes. It's like somebody's grabbing me and throwing me into a trunk. I don't really know where I'm going, and I'm kind of banging around. There's lots of fancy adjectives and sort of vivid writing, but I have no clue what's going on. And eventually I just get tired of being bonked around in the trunk and I get out. But when I read a great novel or when I read a great story, I have from almost the first paragraph just the opposite feeling. It's as if the narrator is saying, listen, we are headed, they're standing by a beautiful car. It's not a Tesla, but some kind of beautiful car. They're standing by a beautiful car and it's gleaming. And they're saying, look, I know it's sunny right now, but it's going to get dark really soon. And we're headed to the darkest part of the map, and some really fucked up shit is going to happen. I don't even know if I'm going to survive or you're going to survive it, emotionally or otherwise. But that's where we're headed. And you can come with me. I don't care. That's where the story is going. And you sort of feel like, as a reader, like you would be a fool not to get in the car. That's what a great narrator does. And one of the central tools they have is that they use really efficient exposition to set out the world they're in and who we should care about and who's in the room and what's at stake. And then they allow the scenes to really be the moments that are the most worthy of being. They're not just trying to convey information. They're putting the characters into dangerous situations, forcing the characters to act, introducing or escalating tension or conflict, instigating further action. That's what really good scenes are there for. And they're really beautifully set up by a strong narrator, what I call a strong independent narrator who kind of moves the story forward.
I want to talk briefly about the title. It's a very interesting title, and I want to set that up by reading a quote from an article that was written by one of the Neiman publications when the book first came out. very intrigued by, we all talk a lot about empathy, as we should in our writing in our classes. It might have been sort of ever since Leslie Jameson's The Empathy Exam sort of kind of added that word more loudly to our nomenclature. But I'm really intrigued by this notion of mercy. And in his article, you're quoted as saying that love is expressed through writing when writers tap into mercy to not just attempt to understand why someone acts a certain way, but to avoid issuing a verdict. Can you talk a little bit about that and the title of the book?
Yeah, so let's talk about the shorthand. One of my shorthand terms that I started to use was truth is the arrow and mercy is the bow. And what I meant by that is when you're writing, whether it's fiction, poetry, nonfiction, what you're aiming for is a certain velocity to the truth that people don't encounter off the page because we're so busy presenting a certain version of ourselves for social media or avoiding conflict or hiding from difficult, painful truths in the world around us and the world inside of us. And part of the reason I really like storytelling is I feel like it's like great stand-up comedy. I feel like, at last, the bullshit of marketing culture is falling away. And we're talking about how hard it is to be human for everybody. I feel like the great, beautiful truth, and it's also a very painful truth, is that everybody is trying as hard as they can. And if they can't do better, then they can't do better. If they were cruel to you and they had power over you, something in them got screwed up and their love got distorted into evil. And your job isn't to pretend that they were born going, wah, wah, I want to screw somebody's life up. Nobody comes into this world, I don't believe, with evil impulses. I think they kind of want to be loved and they want to love, and somehow that plan gets messed up. And it's your job to investigate how. I'm not saying anything Christ wasn't saying, frankly. That's what the Sermon on the Mount is all about. I mean, that guy was saying, you're not there to burnish the saint. You're there to try to spend time with the sinner and understand the nature of why they got to this place and forgive them because they couldn't do any better. And that is really important. I mean, it sounds fine as a kind of idea. It's very hard to live into. But that's why I like writing. Off the page, I am full of grievance and anxiety and pettiness and competitive bullshit and ego need and everything. I'm a mess. But on the page, I can kind of edit myself into some greater state of grace. It's like the place where I can go and say, actually, I know that person was doing their best, and I need to think for a while, get outside my own sense of injury and think about their stake in things. And I'll give you an example. In All the Secrets of the World, I found, to my astonishment, the novel I wrote after many years of failing at writing novels, I found that Nancy Reagan was a point of view character. Now, it will not come as any great shock to you that Nancy Reagan had lived in my depraved moral imagination as a kind of modern Marie Antoinette for years. I had just thought, what a let them eat cake, Gucci obsessed, anorexic, meanie. What a kind of superficial person. Just say no to drugs, like that was going to solve it. And so, like all of us, I had a deep well of bigotry aimed at whatever it was that I didn't really care about more, think about more. But then Nancy Reagan shows up in my novel as a point of view character. And now I have to think very differently. I have to think not in what ways am I different than Nancy Reagan? In what ways can I put Nancy Reagan down? In what ways can I flatten Nancy Reagan into a caricature? I have to think just the opposite. In what ways do I understand and sympathize with and share Nancy Reagan's worldview? And so I started researching Nancy Reagan. And she believed that her husband was destined to be the president of the United States. She was kind of like his prophet. There's a Messiah and then there's a prophet. And she believed like Ronnie's, and whatever you feel about Reagan, I'm certainly no fan, but she believed that. And I'm not thinking about myself now, I'm thinking about Nancy Reagan. So she believes her husband is meant to be the president of the United States, and she does everything in her power to have her husband ascend to that role. And sure enough, for complicated and kind of screwed up reasons, he does. And he's elected president, and nobody's happier than Nancy. And then 3 months later, as some of you will remember, a would-be assassin puts a bullet into Reagan's chest, shoots him, and the bullet travels through his armpit and it stops about a quarter of an inch from the aorta. And Reagan is almost killed. And now Nancy Reagan has seen that the thing that she prophesized and pushed for has actually meant that her beloved is almost killed, struck dead. And now Nancy Reagan's mind is both hounded by guilt and also the kind of magical thinking that we need to adopt when we feel that somebody we love is imperiled. We'll just believe anything. And so she turns to the stars and her astrologer and proceeds to think, well, if Mercury's in retrograde, then Ronnie will be safe, and so on and so forth. And I couldn't say that Nancy Reagan was doing any differently than I would, because if one of my kids or my partner or my dad or whoever, somebody I love, was imperiled in that way, I too would just do anything. I would light the sage and I'd do whatever. Other people might say it's kooky or superstitious or whatever, but I would do it. And so would you. And so that's what I mean, is that you only travel as far into the truth as mercy will get you. And it's especially important for nonfiction writers, because when you're telling stories as a nonfiction writer, it's very empowering because you get to tell the story. And it's also very guilt-provoking because you're telling the story. And if the story's any good, you're probably breaking some silences. And that means you're probably waking up some ghosts. And so you need to know within yourself that you're not going in search of vengeance. I know it's very fashionable to go in search of vengeance, but not in our line of business. We're in the forgiveness business and the understanding business. And so your job is, to the extent that you can, to remember that you have to go into those painful rooms and try to understand what everybody was thinking and feeling so that you can deeply understand why they did what they did. And that doesn't mean that you don't document, for instance, a damaging parent who was cruel to you, but it does mean that you try to understand who they were before they were your parent and what pain was put on them that they then put on you. Not so that you can absolve them of what they did, but simply so that you can understand it. And it doesn't come off as a kind of grievance. So that's what I mean by mercy being kind of the, truth is the arrow, but it's only going to travel as far as your mercy propels it.
Thank you. Thank you. How about some questions from the audience about craft, mercy?
Yeah, whatever's on your guys' mind. And certainly your own writing, your projects.
Writing.
What is the part of your craft that you feel most fights against you, in a sense? What part do you feel like you need to really wrestle with to get it onto the page rather than flowing as naturally as the rest?
Wow, that's a tough question. I mean, it's a great question because I can't just go, oh yeah, I know the answer to that one.
Yeah, because it varies. It can be anything. It can be close grade.
Yeah. I mean, I think what I would say is that there are certain subjects that I won't go close to because they're too exposing to people who I feel obligated to protect. And it's very tough because I want to tell those stories because I think about them constantly. For instance, my kids. And my most vulnerable kid, I am obsessed with him and I think about him all the time and I get very weepy whenever I even start to go close to the kind of struggle that he's in. But I can't tell that story yet because he's a kid and I need to have a relationship with him as a parent, not as a chronicler, or, you know what I mean? So that is a kind of story that I'm living and thinking about all the time, but I'm not committing to paper. It's not a part of my work output. I struggle very deeply with novels and the novel form because of its technical difficulties, and also because the way my mind and brain and storytelling works is much more intuitive, and I didn't have the executive function skills required to introduce a set of characters and create, I'm really good with voice and velocity, and that will get you 50 pages or maybe 100, and then you need a plan. And I'm not good at that. not good at planning like that. It's not how my mind works. So I did finally manage to write a novel, but like that was after that was after 5 failures and giving up, which again, I recommend. I just gave up on the idea that I would ever write a novel. And that winds up being incredibly helpful, because I think when you stop putting pressure on yourself, you open up a certain kind of imaginative space, and that's when the muse will do business with you. The muse will not do business with you if you are like grinding to find the story and beating yourself up for not finding it more quickly. And whenever I've tried to do that, it's been a disaster. And those novels are kind of long, months and years long examples of me just trying to wring it out, and it just doesn't work. I just pushed and pushed and pushed. I feel like you need the story to be pulling. It doesn't have to pull all the time. You got to, put some elbow grease into it. But you need, I think of it energetically, the story needs to be giving you energy. You need to feel a sense of urgency about it, even if that is exposing and worrying. Like, it's good to be really urgently upset or anxious about writing a story. It means it matters to you, even if some of that anxiety is inhibitory. That's something for you to work through. But the question really of any story is it alive? Does it feel energetically alive to you?
After the strategy of giving up, what did you do to overcome the executive function struggles through writing the novel?
I looked at my failed novels and diagnosed why they failed, and started to notice certain patterns. Passive, like terrible narrative stance that didn't get information to the reader effectively. A lot of what I think of as, Frank Conroy calls it abject naturalism. I think of it as daisy chaining, and it sounds like this happened and this happened and this happened and this happened and this happened. It's deadly dull. What's exciting is this happened, and therefore this next thing happened because of that, this third thing happened. That's consequent action, what Aristotle calls the artful arrangement of incidents. That creates unbelievable tension. And once I plugged into that, it started to make sense to me, like, oh, okay, that's the plan, the chain of consequence. That arose from a character whose desires were inevitably and tragically linked to danger. So my central character, which again, the muse walked into my imagination. I didn't think her up with my big brain. It was luck, or it was good fortune, or it was paying attention at the right moment. But Lorena is been told her whole life to remain invisible because her family's undocumented, and she's young, she's Honduran American, and she's living in 1980, Reagan's America. And so she's been told quite sensibly to remain invisible because it's unsafe to become visible. The problem is she's desperate to become visible. She wants to be seen for her tremendous intelligence and her courage and even her desires and her, her body, which is developing and having yearnings of its own. And so when you have that kind of tension, as an author that she needs to become visible. That's what you have to do to that character, is you have to make them visible. You have to have them walk into a house where 2 adults are laser focused on her and are making her feel great excitement, and know that in terms of the plot, that's drawing her deeper and deeper into danger, that her desire is linked to danger. And the more she desires, the deeper danger she's going to be in. And suddenly her parents are pulled into it, and Nancy Reagan's pulled into it, and the FBI, and then you've got a book. But that for me was partly the result of seeing all the ways that the light bulb isn't invented and trying to diagnose some of those. Yeah.
Can you talk more about what narrative stance is?
Sure. So we tend to talk in workshops about point of view, which is a part of narrative stance. But a good narrative stance, for instance, means that your first person narrator, that you as the author recognize that your first person narrator, if they're any good, is both a character in the story, Holden Caulfield having his nervous breakdown in New York City, Esther Greenwood, whoever it is, and is also the narrator, which is an older, wiser version of the character who's reacting to the events of the story. And the narrator, the older, wiser narrator, doesn't understand everything, but understands more about what matters, what needs to be presented to the reader, where the meaning is in the events. Because otherwise you slip into, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. Abject naturalism or daisy chain. So the narrator is this older, wiser perspective that doesn't just chronicle the events, but interprets them. It's what Vivian Gornick calls a useful point of view. And that's for first person. For third person, you aren't stuck in omniscience or radical subjectivity where you're in a close third person perspective. The best narrative stances, like in Austen and Tolstoy and all those authors, George Eliot, are supple. They move from something like all happy families are alike, every unhappy family is unhappy in a different way, some big, broad, direct to the reader declaration that's total omniscience and stating of the theme of the novel, that kind of storytelling. To, when the action's really heating up, jumping inside Anna Karenina's body, mind, and heart when she's in a moment of great drama. Do you see what I mean? There's like a suppleness in that narrative stance. It's not one way or the other. It has the ability to be, to be deep inside characters and also to speak directly to the reader and give really important information and even insight. That's what excites me. And those are the places where I feel like the story is the most exciting to read because I'm following the characters, but I also really like listening to the person telling the story. And that's the difference really between literary storytelling and movies and TV, which are really exciting, but they don't have a teller. They don't need one. What marks literary storytelling as unique and special as a form of storytelling is that it has a narrator. God said, let there be light, right? So that to me is like something that I think because of our anxiety that the reader's going to get bored and wander off to Netflix, we're constantly like plunging into scene because of our insecurity. Oh my God, we can't like establish a narrative voice. We have to immediately get into the action in media res. And I think that's a narrative stance that's sort of frantic and anxiety driven. It's not measured and thoughtful. And it doesn't gently guide the reader through the story. That's what the narrator is. They're a go-between between the author and the reader. And you have to remember that storytelling for most of human history has been oral. And the storyteller shared the worldview and the immediate environment with the listener. Nobody had to say like, oh, the God of the river, because you knew who the God of the river was. But when we started printing stories, there was this sudden problem of disjunction between the person who wrote the story, Ezra, like scribbling down Leviticus, back in whatever, and whoever might read it 1,000 or 2,000 years later and 6,000 miles away. And so you needed this narrator who could guide the reader, who might be in a totally different time and place from where the story was composed. And that's where the narrator arose and gave great clarity to the kinds of stories we tell. Part of the reason that I think the world and the country is in a very dangerous and cruel place is because we have narrators who are quite fraudulent and cruel. They're trying to get us to hate each other and look down on people and, kind of scapegoat people. And when you have a bad narrator, you're going to have a bad story, and a bad story has bad outcomes, unfortunately. So we really need good narrators. FDR, when he delivered the fireside chats every week, was a wonderful narrator. He was trying to say, here's the nature of this economic struggle, this national struggle we're in, and here's what we're trying to do. And I'm going to narrate you through the story of where America is right now, what we're doing to try to make it better. That kind of narrator, unfortunately, isn't on duty at the moment. Other questions? I won't talk anymore about.
Yeah, I'm just interested, since it varies so much from writer to writer, what is your process, especially for writing your short fiction? What does your writing process look like? And with your short fiction, is there something that helps you feel like, okay, this story is done? this story is ready to go out into the world. It's out of my hands now.
Right, yeah. Well, I'm primarily a short story writer, so that maybe I should have an answer for this. But I would say that my writing process is extremely spotty and weird and chaotic. The only thing I can say consistently is that I write better in the morning because of, I don't know, I'm fresh from dreams, and dreams are their own kind of self-propelled stories. And the day and all of its aggravations and grievances and distractions hasn't gotten to me. So I do better in the mornings. But the truth is that the longer I've been writing, the more I realize that I don't really have a process. I just try to write when I feel that I can concentrate my attention. That's what writing is, or any kind of creation. It's the ability to focus in the midst of distraction. And I for years would ask people about their process, and I remember a guy came to my MFA program. He was an author who I love. He'd written this book of stories that I worship, and somebody, probably me, said, "What's your process?" And he said, "Well, I must tell you, I must write for 4 hours to reach the spiritual depth in which I am on the same plane as my characters, and I can commune with them and tell their stories. And I'm in the front row, like that 4 hour spiritual plane. Blah, blah, blah." And for years, I thought, okay, I've got to write for 4 hours or I won't reach the spiritual plane because the guy said it. And it turns out that was not very helpful for me. What I would say about process is think about how you operate as a person when your attention is the most attenuated and sharp. Is it in the morning? Is it late at night? Are you a coffee drinker and that's what gets you focused, or are you a wine drinker and that's what gets you kind of loosened up? Do you want to be in a place that's crowded where you can hear snips of dialogue and that kind of way, or do you need to be in a quiet place? Whatever it is that where you write the best, if it's long stretches or short bursts, whatever it is that works for you, that's your process. I really believe that. As for the question of when something's done, I mean, I don't want to say like you're never done, but what I would say is that at a certain point you feel an intuitive sense that you've made the best decisions that you're capable of making. And then it's kind of up to the world. Sometimes the world says, those decisions aren't going to work for our magazine. And then you or other beta readers will read it and say, I'm confused here, or the ending doesn't really land with me, or whatever they say. And then you revisit those decisions. I still read sometimes, not often, but if I'm reading an old story, I'll look at it and say, oh shit, I didn't need that word. You know, so like there's just the time that you stop making decisions. And but I usually have an intuitive sense of like, I think I've brought this to as close as I can get it given my limitations. And that's when you stop making decisions and you let the world decide, which is not easy because the world's like probably going to say no a bunch of times. So, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't try anyway. So. Other questions? Yeah.
I do have a question about content and giving, avoiding giving the reader whiplash. If you were to write about what's gone on in the last 3 weeks
Yep.
in a novel, what would you weed out? Because it's just too much back and forth.
Yeah. I mean, what I would say is that trying to capture too much, you sacrifice depth when you try to go wide. And so like what I always think about is if there's going to be kind of an opposition to this current regime or administration, you're going to have to figure out a way to not just say, boy, there's people are really indiscriminately going after the government in ways that are destructive. You literally need to find a single individual who has been fired from an important job that you can say in concrete ways is might hurt people, might make their food less safe or their water or their nuclear weapons less secure, whatever it is. or that they are doing good and important work and their arbitrary firing is appreciably hurting them and their family, the family they're trying to, like, that's how people actually relate to the world, is through individual stories, not through big, broad generalizations. And so what I generally say is I would not try to create a summary. When I wrote about Lorena, what I was trying to articulate was that the story that we tell about immigration is pathological and sadistic. It's not an invading army. It's a bunch of usually traumatized people who leave their home, which I guess all of you guys have homes. And if you were in sufficient danger or you felt there was opportunity elsewhere that didn't exist, it would be a very difficult decision for you to have to pack up, take whatever you could, especially if you're traveling with children, and try to hope that you're going to get to the promised land. Those are people who in one way or another are suffering from a sense of dislocation and trauma that is unimaginable to most people in this room, because we just live cosseted within a certain kind of privilege. And but saying that sounds laudable, but it's not dramatically interesting. Telling the story of Lorena and her mother and father and brother and their individual story and how vulnerable they are to getting chewed up and spit out by the criminal justice system and the immigration system is, to me, dramatically interesting. I started writing that novel without knowing it when I lived in El Paso as a 21-year-old or 22-year-old. And I'd grown up in suburban Northern California as a white, straight dude whose parents were doctors. So I was in the upper middle class. And I didn't even know where El Paso was. Like some of you might not know where El Paso was. When I had to drive there, I was like, where am I going? And I planned for about 10 hours, and it took me about 14 hours to drive there. And by the time I had gotten to the outskirts of El Paso from Northern California, I was in this sort of phantasmagoric fugue state. And I remember this green sign, the roadside signs rising up, and thinking, I'm about to get to El Paso. I wonder where the fuck El Paso is. And it said, El Paso, 11 miles. And then underneath that, it said San Antonio, 522 miles. And I said, holy shit, that's where El Paso is. It's a long way from anywhere else. But anyway, I get to El Paso, and my job is to go to the newspaper and write kind of stupid, clever reviews of heavy metal bands and country bands. That's why I was in the George Strait newsletter. And it was fine. I liked doing it, but it wasn't really what was happening in El Paso. El Paso is the largest border community with Juarez in the Western Hemisphere. And so when I got up in the morning and drank my coffee in my little apartment in Sunset Heights on the 4th floor, what I was looking over was the Rio Grande. And what I could see every morning was the morning commute for the day maids. And so there were these young women who came across the Rio Grande, which is dirty and dangerous. People would drown in it frequently. And so they hired these guys called mullahs for $1 or whatever it was. And they would ride across on these guys' shoulders. These guys were wading through, waist deep, very dirty water. And they would carry these young women to the other side of the embankment, the American side, and these women would scramble up the side of the embankment and they would pull back. There was a couple places where the chain link fence had a hole, and they would peel it back and they would invade America. And then they would have to change into their work clothes because their commuting clothes had gotten dirty. And that meant that these young women would have to take their clean clothes out of their plastic sack, and they would have to strip down to their underwear and put on their work clothes in the desert scrub. And it was cold, so they were shivering, and they had to do it very quickly, because if they didn't do it quickly enough, the Migra vans, the INS vans, would come and pick them up and bring them back to Juarez, and they'd have to start all over again or miss a day of work. And then once they'd done that and gotten all dressed, they would run very quickly across the low desert scrub and try to reach South El Paso Street so they could blend in to the street life there. And then they would take a bus up to Coronado Hills or one of the other places where families like the one I grew up in would hire them to work for 10 or 12 hours at a wage that no American would accept. And then when that was over, they would take the bus back down and they would walk across back to Juarez and have a little bit more money than they would have had had they tried to find work in Mexico. And that stayed with me for a while. I wasn't writing about it, but it was up here. I was thinking about it. And that is where the genesis of that novel was trying to think, what is it like to be in that kind of vulnerability? And that scene that I just described sort of made its way eventually into the novel. So that's, for me, kind of how it works. The story is this propulsive force, and when the story is moving, it's like a rocket, and you know how the jets of a rocket kind of act like a vacuum and they suck things out? They suck things out of your memory and out of your things you didn't even remember that you remembered, and out of your subconscious. And that's what makes its way into the story. Yeah.
Time
maybe-
for one last question.
One last one. Sure.
Well, lucky me. So
Pressure's on. Don't blow it.
So you said something really interesting. You said we are in the forgiving and understanding business. No room for vengeance. What part of, do you think anger has a role in writing? What is its role? Do you think it is, if you're fueled by frustration, that it can help to get it out? And how do you think that one can increase their kind of like forgiveness and ability to have more mercy, as you call it, or just more compassion and empathy, even for those who have possibly hurt them or who are struggling with like anger?
Yeah, I think anger actually is a very useful emotion. It can be, because it's very quick to the truth. So when you listen to somebody who's angry, they're kind of dangerous in an interesting and useful way, because they will say things that we normally inhibit. So one of the books that I write about in Truth is the Arrow, it has a lot of books that I love that I cite, is this book, The Woman Upstairs, the Claire Massoud novel. Does anybody know that book, The Woman Upstairs? And it's basically a Jeremiah. That's a fancy word for like a long rant, like Jeremiah the prophet, right? And it's like fun, because that's a good example. Jeremiah and Isaiah the prophets, they were angry. They were angry. And Woody Guthrie also was angry. Angry at injustice, angry at impiety, whatever it is. And Christ actually, when he tips over the money changers table, he's angry. He's like, fuck crypto. That's not the way to live, right? Our heads have been shut off with money. This is not the way to live. And so anger is actually useful because it gets people acting and truth-telling. However, in The Woman Upstairs, all of this anger is very exciting to hear, but you realize that when you listen to somebody who's angry, that even though a lot of truth can come out with that anger, it's hiding something. And what it's hiding, Claire Massoud tells us, is sorrow. She says that there's this roaring anger that is forever trying to melt this kernel of sorrow, and it never does. And another way of thinking about it is that certain kinds of writing and living, I guess, are consumed with the defensive emotions. And they ultimately do not reach underneath them. And the reader will get bored of them and feel thwarted by them. So your job is to strip away the defensive emotion. So if a character like the character in Claire Massoud's novel, she eventually realizes that her rage has been hiding the sense that she feels great sorrow that her life hasn't turned out as she wished it would, and that she's partly complicit in that. And if you strip away grievance, which seems to be a national sport, and you really kind of give truth serum to the aggrieved, you'll realize that they're suffering from some kind of grief. And if you strip away the alienation of all the clove cigarette smoking people listening to The Cure, you'll realize that underneath that disaffection and alienation is some kind of thwarted desire. And that's your job. I think good stories are the place where we can strip away the defensive emotions so that the reader can have the experience of feeling less alone in the real feelings that they're having, which are vulnerable feelings. And then also the writer feels less alone too, because they've identified that underneath all the surface story, the angry rant, is that they're in pain and that they don't have to be alone in pain. Okay, that's about enough
Thanks,
happy awesome.
Steve.
Yeah.